We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. This session is being recorded. My name is Jamie McLaughlin. I'm your moderator today. I serve as the programming vice chair of the ABA International Law Section, International Animal Law Committee. I am also serving now as the vice president of the UIA, that's the International Association of Lawyers, Animal Law Commission Working Group. Today, our program is going to cover elephants, science, and the law. It's the first of a new series that we're doing with the UIA, and this one is a joint program today with the ABA. I'm going to be introducing our speakers, and then we're going to be getting started. A couple of housekeeping notes. We are a closed webinar today, so your questions will not be coming to the speakers. However, if you want to contact the speakers after the fact for specific questions, you can do that. The program's an hour and a half. There is no CLE for this program. As I said before, it's going to be recorded and it will be posted by the ABA and the UIA. To get started and introduce our esteemed panel today, we are very excited to welcome Mickey Pardo. He is a behavioral ecologist and bioacoustician interested in the intersection of animal communication, cognition, and conservation. He got his PhD in behavioral ecology from Cornell, where he studied vocal communication and social cognition in both Asian elephants and acorn woodpeckers. He completed an NSF postdoctoral fellowship at Colorado State University on vocal communication in African elephants, working in collaboration with Save the Elephants in Kenya. He's currently a postdoctoral associate at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he's using passive acoustics and AI to monitor bird populations. Dr. Pardo has authored more than 10 scholarly publications, including in top scientific journals such as Nature, Ecology, and Evolution and Current Biology. His work has been featured by over 3,000 media outlets in more than 90 countries, including the New York Times and the BBC. He's also an advocate for the rights of non-human animals and for the food system reform to end our reliance on animal agriculture and commercial fishing. Our second speaker today is lawyer Jim Karani. He is a Kenyan attorney who advises on criminal, animal, and environmental law. He works in the courts with policymakers and stakeholders to strengthen the legal protection of wildlife species and the habitats that they live in. Jim is currently pursuing a PhD in criminal justice at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, where he researches the trafficking of elephant ivory in Africa. Our third speaker today is Debbie Ethell. She's an acclaimed author and conservation research scientist based in Portland, Oregon. She's best known for her breakout memoir, The Will of Heaven, which has been adapted into a book series chronicling her journey to fulfill her lifelong dream of working with wild elephants and overcoming addiction. Her highly anticipated second book, Elephant Mountain, is set for release in February 2025. As the former executive director of the Coda Foundation for Elephants, Debbie not only taught elephant conservation in a rural region of Kenya, but also supported education by providing desks for over 900 students across 6 schools, reflecting her belief that if you can't save elephants if you don't help the people who live alongside them. Through her work as a consultant for various animal advocacy groups such as the Non-Human Rights Project, Friends of Animals, and most recently One Voice in France, Debbie has traveled the world educating the public about elephants. Her research has been featured in prominent publications and scientific journals, and she continues to inspire young people to pursue careers in the field of science and conservation. So we're going to begin now with our first speaker, Mickey Pardo. Welcome, Mickey.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen now. Let's see. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk today about elephant cognition, and then I'm going to delve a little bit into the implications of elephant cognition for welfare, but primarily I'm going to focus on the science behind elephant cognition. So elephants have an exceptionally complex social system. There are 3 species of elephants: African savanna elephants, African forest elephants, and Asian elephants. And the one that's been studied the most by far is the African savanna elephant. So in all 3 species of elephants, adult males live separately from females and their offspring. So females often stay with their mother for life. Males typically leave around the time that they hit puberty and go off on their own. So in African savanna elephants, female society is extremely tightly knit. And they have this sort of nested tier-like structure to their social system. So the basic unit of sociality is females and their dependent offspring, and then related females together form what's often called a family group or sometimes a core group. Then multiple family groups, which are typically related to each other, form a bond group. So the average number of family groups per bond group is around 2, and then bond groups cluster together to form a more loosely affiliated clan. So there's these family groups and then bond groups and clans. It's this really complex nested network of social relationships. In Asian elephants, they also have a lot of complex relationships, but there isn't this clear hierarchically nested structure. And in forest elephants, their relationships are the most fluid of all because of the environment they live in. They can't really go around in very large groups. So most often you see mothers and their dependent offspring together, but they do have relationships with other elephants. They just see each other less frequently. And the males, which live separately from adult females, have their own social networks as well, which are more loosely associated than the females' bonds, but social relationships are still extremely important to the males. Now, in animal behavior research, there's this hypothesis called the social complexity hypothesis or the social brain hypothesis. And the idea is that intelligence in many species evolved specifically to deal with the complexities of living in a complex social environment, rather than, for example, to deal with the complexities of living in the physical environment. So there's a lot of evidence for this in a variety of species. So for example, in primates, there's a significant relationship between the size of the neocortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for higher order cognition, relative to the rest of the brain, and the mean group size of that animals live in. So primates with larger group sizes tend to have a relatively bigger neocortex compared to the rest of their brain than primates that live in smaller groups. Similarly, a study with parrots in captivity found that spectacled parrotlets, which in the wild have a very complex social system with a lot of fluid relationships where they're coming apart and coming back together again, they tend to be better at learning a particular cognitive task involving figuring out how to pull up a string to get food than parrots that live in relatively simpler social systems in the wild. Another study on jays found that pinyon jays, which have an extremely complex social system, tend to be better at understanding social relationships in a particular way than scrub jays, which have a relatively simpler social system in the wild. And kind of as a corollary to this, there's also a hypothesis that as social complexity increases, the complexity of your vocal communication system will increase as well. The idea being that communication is how animals mediate their social interactions. So if you have more complex social interactions to deal with, you're going to need a more complex communication system to handle that. And there's some evidence for that as well. So for example, a study on Carolina chickadees found that when they were when researchers manipulated the group size of birds, the complexity of their vocalizations increased as the size of their groups increased. So to bring this back to elephants, elephants have an unusually complex social system, so we might expect them to be unusually intelligent. So how can we assess this? Well, one thing that people have done is to look at elephants' brains. And it turns out that elephants actually have about 3 times as many neurons in their brains as humans do, which is not too surprising. They're a lot bigger than us, and a big part of what the brain does is simply, maintain the function of your body. But they also have, in addition to having a great deal of neurons in their brain, there are also other aspects of the structure of the brain that suggest there may be capacity for higher order cognitive processing. So for example, the dendrites of their pyramidal neurons, which are a type of neuron that's very common in the cortex, they're quite long, which allows them to branch out and make lots of connections with other neurons, and potentially allows for more complex higher order processing. So in order to actually assess how intelligent elephants are, we need to look at their behavior. You can't really, brain size is correlated with intelligence, but it's not a perfect correlation. It's difficult to really understand the relationship between brain structure and intelligence. So we need to do some behavioral experiments. So people have tried to do this with captive elephants, but one of the challenges there is that your sample sizes tend to be quite small. So one study, for example, tried to assess whether elephants could sort of think through a problem in their head, reason it out, and come up with a solution without trial and error. And this is called insight. So the idea behind insight is that you think through the problem, you come up with a solution spontaneously without trying and failing at a bunch of different things first. So in this experiment, they had a few elephants in a zoo environment. They hung food just out of reach, and they provided the elephants with some objects in their enclosure that they could stand on. One of these elephants spontaneously figured out that he could stand on these boxes and reach the food. And it wasn't through trial and error, so he didn't stand and fail a bunch of times and try a bunch of different things. He just spontaneously figured out that he could move this box over to where the food was, stand on it, and get the food. The other elephants didn't exhibit that behavior. Does that mean they're incapable of insight, or they just didn't show it in this particular case? It's pretty hard to know. And that, again, is a challenge with some of the other studies in captivity as well. So one study tried to assess whether elephants were self-aware by exposing them to the classic mirror mark test. So the idea behind this test is that an animal is placed in front of a mirror, allowed to acclimate to it. Then you put a mark on a part of their body where they couldn't see without the use of the mirror, put them back in front of the mirror, and see if they touch the mark in the presence of the mirror more than they did without the mirror. And then you also mark them with a sham mark, which is invisible, just to make sure that there wasn't something with the marking process itself that they could feel that allowed them to touch the mark that way. So this study, somebody tried this study with elephants a long time ago. Both elephants failed to pass the test. And then in 2006, they tried the study again, but this time with a bigger mirror. Since elephants don't have great vision to begin with, they thought maybe the mirror was the issue. So when they used a full-length mirror, they tested 3 elephants at the Bronx Zoo, Patty, Maxine, and Happy. Patty and Maxine did not pass the test. They did not touch the mark any more than in the presence of the mirror than without it, and they didn't touch the mark any more than they touched the sham mark. But Happy did pass, so she touched the mark significantly more in the presence of the mirror than without the mirror. And again, here, the absence of passing the mirror test doesn't necessarily indicate that an animal is not self-aware. The test is very prone to false negatives because animals may simply not be motivated to touch the mark. So for example, elephants in the wild like being dirty. They cover themselves in debris all the time. So maybe they just don't care about a mark on their face. But the fact that one elephant did clearly pass the test suggests that at least some elephants are capable of recognizing themselves in a mirror, which likely indicates some form of self-awareness. But again, this is kind of limited in what we can conclude from these studies with small sample sizes and even smaller numbers of individuals who actually pass the test. So from studies in the wild, we have an opposite problem, which is that the experiment can't be controlled as easily, but we can get much bigger sample sizes, and it's a much more ecologically relevant context. So by studying elephants in the wild, we can understand a little bit more about how they actually use intelligence and how their intelligence may have evolved. So one such experiment played back the calls of specific elephants to other elephants that in the same population. And they found that not only did elephants recognize other individuals by the sound of their voice, but they could distinguish between 3 different categories of individuals. So they reacted differently to the calls of elephants that were their close social affiliates, so members of their family group or bond group, distant social affiliates, so members of their clan, and then non-affiliates, so individuals outside their clan. They treated these 3 categories of elephants differently when researchers played their calls back. So if elephants can recognize at least everybody in their clan, that suggests that they can recognize at least 100 individuals on average just from the sound of their voice. So they have a pretty extensive network of individuals that they recognize at least by the sound of their calls. But elephants didn't all perform equally in this regard. So they found that when elephant families that had an older matriarch, an older female who leads the family, tended to be better at making these social distinctions. And subsequent studies further substantiated this idea that the age of the matriarch and the experience of the matriarch of a group makes a big difference in what elephants know about their environment. So, for example, another study by some of the same researchers compared elephants in Amboseli National Park in Kenya, which is a relatively undisturbed population, with elephants in South Africa who had been disrupted by culling. So in the 1980s, South Africa and some other southern African countries culled a bunch of elephants because they were concerned that they were overgrazing or overbrowsing the habitat and destroying too many trees. So they killed a bunch of elephants. And the way they did this was that they would shoot all the adults in the family, but leave the youngsters, and then they would sell the youngsters to private game reserves. So a lot of these elephants ended up experiencing a very traumatic event when they were young, and then growing up without the benefit of having an older matriarch to learn from. And when researchers repeated this experiment of playing back calls to elephants in Amboseli versus elephants in this disturbed population, they found that elephants in the disturbed population, where the matriarchs didn't have the benefit of growing up with an experienced matriarch of their own, they tended to be much worse at making this social distinction. Similarly, when researchers played back lion calls to the elephants, they found that elephants with older, more experienced matriarchs who were from an undisturbed childhood, they were better at recognizing the difference between male and female lions, and male lions pose a much bigger threat to elephants than females do, whereas females who grew up without the benefit of an older matriarch were not able to make that distinction. Elephants can also distinguish between different human populations. So in Amboseli National Park in Kenya, there are basically two ethnic groups that live near the park, the Maasai and the Kamba. And at least historically, I'm not sure if this is still true anymore, but at least historically, elephants would sometimes come into conflict with Maasai, because sometimes Maasai men would spear an elephant as sort of a way of proving their manhood, whereas the Kamba and the elephants pretty much didn't have any conflict with each other, at least at that point in time. So researchers played back voices of men, women, and children from these different ethnic groups, and also presented elephants with clothing that had been worn by men from these two different ethnic groups. Now, the Maasai and the Kamba have very different lifestyles, and that affects how their clothing smells. And it turned out that elephants made a big distinction between the smell of clothes worn by Maasai men and clothes worn by Kamba men. They were much more afraid of the clothes worn by the Maasai men. And similarly, they were much more afraid of the voices of people speaking Ma, the Maasai language, especially when the speakers were young men as opposed to children or women. So it shows a rather sophisticated understanding of the nature of different threats and a pretty fine-tuned ability to discriminate between different vocal and olfactory cues. Now, elephants are famous for having an excellent memory. The old adage, an elephant never forgets. And surprisingly, there's actually less research than you might think to back this up. We don't know nearly as much as you might expect about elephant memory. But one thing we do know is that there was a study that assessed elephants' ability to keep a bunch of things in mind at once, which is called working memory. So the ability to keep track of multiple entities at the same time. Now, in humans, our working memory on average is about 7 items. We can keep about 7 items in our head without losing track of them, give or take a few, but that's the average for humans. So in this study led by Lucy Bates, she she waited until an elephant family was moving in a sort of linear fashion. So they were all kind of lined up with each other and somewhat spread out from one another. And then she would wait until an elephant at the beginning, at the front of the group, urinated, go over to where she urinated, dig up the dirt that was soaked with urine, and then move it to another point in the line. So another elephant in the family would walk up and encounter the urine as she was walking. And she presented this in two different ways. One was a normal circumstance where urine from an elephant in front of the subject was presented to the subject, so it was perfectly natural for that individual's urine to be in her path. And the other treatment was the unnatural treatment, where the urine was presented from somebody behind the subject. So it would be highly unusual or impossible, basically, for that individual's urine to be in the subject's path. And if elephants can recognize everybody in their family by the smell of their urine, and they can keep track of where everyone in the family is at any given time, then they should react more strongly to the surprising stimulus of smelling urine from somebody who had been walking behind them and therefore couldn't have urinated in front of them. So when they did this presentation, they found that they found exactly what they expected. Elephants reacted much more strongly to urine from an individual who was behind them, which suggests that they understood not only could they recognize everybody in their family by smell, but they understood where everyone in the family was and could keep track of that at one time. Now, what's remarkable about this is that the average number of elephants that an elephant would have to keep track of in order to do this task is 30, right? Or at least the maximum would be 30, given the size of these families. So that suggests that elephants can keep track of at least 30 items at once, compared to the average of 7 for humans. So that's working memory, but what about long-term memory? Well, we know even less about this. So in the study where Karen McComb played back calls of elephants to other elephants who knew them, she did a couple one-off experiments where she played back a call of an individual who had died or an individual who had left the group and switched groups to another group. So these were elephants that the family hadn't seen in a very long time, in years, in fact, and they still reacted very strongly to these calls as if it was somebody in their family. So it's hard to draw too many conclusions from such a small sample size, but at least anecdotally, this does suggest that elephants likely remember each other's calls for years. And another study more recently in captivity monitored what happened when zoos reintroduced some elephants who used to live together up to 12 years ago, but hadn't been together in a very long time. And when they reintroduced these elephants, I think for one group of elephants, they had been apart for 2 years. Another group of elephants, they had been apart for 12 years. They reacted much more strongly and much more. They had a lot more affiliative interaction, a lot more indication of an emotional greeting when greeting somebody that they used to know versus when greeting somebody that they had never met before. So again, very small sample size, but it does indicate that elephants likely remember each other for many years or even decades. Now, in terms of spatial memory, in a lot of environments, elephants have to keep track of water sources and where they were in previous years. So this is kind of an unorthodox approach to studying animal cognition, but one way that we can try to investigate this is to look at elephant movements and then figure out what's the most likely cognitive strategy that they're figuring out, that they're using to figure out where these water sources are based on how they move. So one study had collared elephants that were collared with GPS tags so they could be tracked by satellite, and then tracked their movements between water holes, and found that the elephants typically made a straight beeline for water holes that were much further away than they would be able to smell, which suggests that they knew the actual location of the water hole and were remembering it rather than just wandering around until they happened to find one, or only sticking near local water holes that they could smell, which suggests that they have a pretty sophisticated long-term memory for spatial locations. Now, one of the most unusual things about elephants, and this is something they share in common with humans, is how cooperative they are. We see aggression in wild elephants much, much less than we see in a lot of other social animals like chimpanzees, for example. One of the ways in which elephants cooperate with each other is in raising young. So it's not just a mother taking care of her calf. The calf has allo mothers as well, which may be the older sister or a cousin or an aunt, other females in the group who take on a lot of the responsibility for caring for the calf, making sure that the calf doesn't wander off, comforting them when they're upset, etc. And in captivity, this is borne out as well. So one experiment done by Josh Plotnick and his research group tried to see if elephants understood how to work together. So this was with Asian elephants in Thailand. They set up this apparatus where there was a board with a rope running through these PVC pipes. And there was food on the board. And the only way to pull the board towards the elephants was by if two elephants pulled on either end of the rope at the same time. Because if one elephant just pulled on one end of the rope would just come out of the PVC piping and the board wouldn't move. And they couldn't reach both ends of the rope at the same time. And the elephants had no problem learning this task. So they understood that they needed help from another elephant to move this, and they would wait for the other elephant to arrive, even if they weren't there yet, rather than impatiently trying to pull on the rope themselves, because they understood that the only way to do this was to collaborate with each other. Similarly, elephants they have a lot of affiliative interactions with their family members. So in primates, there's been a lot of work showing that individuals who have strong relationships comfort one another after aggression. Elephants don't really exhibit that much aggression compared to primates, but one study tried to assess whether they also comfort each other by assessing how much affiliative behavior they exhibited after somebody experienced distress. So once one elephant exhibited distress, and there's certain vocalizations that are reliably associated with distress, the researchers measured how much other elephants spend interacting with them, touching them, vocalizing to them, compared to control periods where there was no distress. And they found that elephants touched their companions and vocalized in an affiliative manner to them much more after their companion exhibited distress than when they didn't exhibit distress, which suggests that they were trying to comfort each other. And in fact, there is a type of rumble that, at least in African savanna elephants, mothers and allo mothers give to calves when a calf has experienced distress. So this likely occurs in African elephants as well. Elephants are also quite well known for what's sometimes called elephant funerals. And the truth of the matter is we don't really understand that much about what's going on here. What we do know is that elephants show an undue interest in, or an atypical interest in the carcasses of other elephants. So a lot of animals will avoid a carcass, especially of a member of their own species, which makes sense because you could potentially contract disease from it. But some animals, including elephants, are particularly interested in the bodies of their members of their own species. They interact with the body, spend a lot of time hanging around with it. They go out of their way to touch it. Occasionally, they even throw handfuls or trunkfuls of dirt on it. And they don't do this with the bones of other species. They only do it with the bones or remains of other elephants. Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be any bias in terms of whether they were related to the dead individual or not. Elephants engage in this kind of behavior with all other elephants, regardless of whether they were related to them. And it's certainly possible that this indicates that they're grieving or that they have some understanding of death. But it's pretty hard to draw that conclusion from the data that we currently have. So I think it's definitely an area that warrants further study, but at the moment, what we can say is it's very intriguing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, complex social systems aren't just associated with complex cognition, they also tend to be associated with complex communication. So this is a sampling of the elephant vocal repertoire. It's not every call that elephants make. I don't know if these calls are going to play, but I'm going to try. So this is a trumpet, which is what people most associate with elephant vocalizations. I'll play that for you. Not sure if you were able to hear that or not, but trumpets are actually not the most common calls elephants make, not by a long shot. Trumpets are basically emotional outbursts that elephants produce when they're excited or upset. The context that they make them in the most varies a little bit across species, but in all elephants, it's associated with some form of emotional arousal. By far, the most common calls elephants make are called rumbles, which are these low-frequency calls that are actually partially below the range of human hearing. And I'll try to play this for you. I'm not sure if you can hear that at all. It sounds quite quiet, but that's actually partially because the speakers on a computer can't play the majority of the call. The frequencies are below the capacity of that speaker to reproduce. So to an elephant, this is going to sound a lot louder than it does, over Zoom. And the thing about rumbles is that they are exceptionally complex calls, and they're produced in almost every behavioral context. So saying that rumbles are just one type of call that elephants make is a little bit misleading because it implies that rumbles might be analogous to like one word in human language. And that's not true. It's more like rumbles, if we divided human language into call types, speech would be a single call type. Similarly to rumbles and elephants, the majority of their communication is rumbles, and they produce them in all sorts of contexts. So, for example, they use it to keep in touch with one another over long distances. They use it to comfort calves when the calves are upset. They use it to express distress about something, to warn others about threats like lions or humans or bees, and also to indicate that they want to start group movement. So, for example, when an elephant wants the group to start moving off in a particular direction, she'll give a specific kind of rumble called a let's go rumble that indicates she wants to start moving off. And then that usually triggers a sort of back and forth exchange of rumbles among, say, like 3 females in the family. And then eventually they make a group decision and move off together. So they're quite complex in how they're used in communication, but there's still a lot that we don't understand about the information that's conveyed by these calls. One study that I did recently, we specifically tried to look at whether elephants include something like a name in their rumbles. So whether they address rumbles to specific individuals or whether they use the same rumble to address everybody. And we recorded a bunch of rumbles where we knew who the call was addressed to and who made the call. And then we used a type of machine learning model called a random forest to see if we could predict who a call was addressed to just from the acoustic structure of the call. And we found that we could. And then I did an experiment where we played back these calls to the elephants. So in this diagram at the bottom, we would record 2 calls from the same elephant that were originally addressed to 2 different individuals. Then we would play back both calls to both individuals, and we expected that each elephant would respond more strongly to the call that was originally addressed to her rather than to the call that was originally addressed to somebody else. So I'm going to play for you a video of a playback that we did to an elephant called Margaret. So this was a call that was originally addressed to Margaret. It was produced by her daughter Marie, and it was originally addressed to her, and now we're playing it back to her. So let's see. So as you can see in this video, Margaret called back immediately to that. I don't know if you could hear the calls or not. And now I'll play what happened when we played back another call from Marie that this time was addressed to somebody else in the family. So it was not addressed to Margaret. That's the playback. And this time there was no vocalization in response. And that's what we saw in general with with these playbacks, on average, elephants responded much more strongly to the calls that were originally addressed to them by vocalizing more quickly, producing more vocalizations on average, and approaching the speaker more quickly than they did in response to a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else. So that suggests that they can tell just by hearing a call if it was intended for them or not, which means that these rumbles contain something like a name that identifies the intended recipient of the call. Now, at the end, I'm just going to pivot a little bit to talking about the challenges that the elephants experience when they're kept in captivity and how that relates to their cognitive abilities. So what we see in captive elephants, especially zoo elephants, is this is everything that I'm saying now is more the case for circus elephants than for zoo elephants, and more the case for zoo elephants than elephants that are kept in more extensive, sort of captive working environments in parts of Asia. So elephants in captivity have elevated cortisol levels. Cortisol is a hormone associated with stress. So this is a pretty clear physiological indicator that being in captivity causes stress to elephants, given that they have these chronically elevated cortisol levels. Now, when an animal has chronically elevated cortisol, an effect that this can create is that it causes dysregulation in the part of the brain that affects movement. So basically, the neurons in the brain are constantly bombarded by these stress hormones, and it messes them up. In a sense, it's sort of a form of brain damage, although it can often be reversed to a degree. And this results in what's called stereotypical behavior. So stereotypical behavior are repetitive movements that don't serve any purpose. In elephants, this often manifests as swaying or rocking back and forth. And this is a clear indicator of poor welfare in basically all mammals. And it's observed in elephants in up to 80% of zoo elephants. One study assessed something like almost 90 elephants across many different zoos, and they found this in they found this behavior in I believe something like 80% of the elephants that they investigated. Another behavior that we often see in zoo elephants is infanticide. So one study from I think 1996 found that elephants who were born in zoos, like of the elephants who were born in zoos and were not, a stillbirth, 16% of them were killed by their mother. That is unheard of in the wild. It's basically doesn't ever happen for elephants to kill their own calves intentionally in the wild, but it's surprisingly common in zoos. There are also a lot of physical ailments that they suffer from in captivity, most commonly obesity and osteoarthritis. So, and that's because in the wild, elephants walk several miles every day. Obviously, in captivity, they can't really do that because there's not enough space. And these factors together, the infanticide and the physical ailments, contribute to a significantly reduced lifespan for elephants in captivity compared to the wild. So how does this relate to elephant cognition? Well, there are a couple ways. So given how social elephants are and how much they rely on social relationships in the wild, it's unsurprising that they experience poor welfare in captivity, because often in a zoo environment, they experience social deprivation. So some elephants are housed alone. This typically isn't something that zoos try to do, but often it happens because an elephant is housed with a companion for many years and then the companion dies. And the zoo is concerned about introducing that elephant to other elephants because they don't know if they'll get along or not. So this is a picture of Happy, the elephant I mentioned earlier, who demonstrated an ability to recognize herself in a mirror. For many years now, she's been housed alone at the Bronx Zoo because her companions that she had previously been housed with died, and the zoo didn't want to introduce her to the other elephants at the zoo because they were afraid, based on past experience, they wouldn't get along. So the end result is she ends up being housed alone. This is particularly common for male elephants. I think it's kind of a holdover from previous times where we thought that male elephants were solitary, but now we know they're not solitary. It's just that their social relationships are more fluid and they're not always with each other 100% of the time, but they absolutely do need social relationships. And so it's even more common for male elephants to be housed alone. But even when elephants are housed together, they're not housed in natural social groupings. They're often housed with just one other elephant. Maybe they can interact with a few other elephants through the bars of a cage, but they can't form the same kind of natural social structure that they would have in the wild. And there have been a number of studies that have documented that elephants who are housed alone or elephants who are transferred between zoos, which often breaks up the relationships that they do have poorer welfare as measured by stress hormones than elephants who are housed with multiple other individuals and not moved around. Another issue of captivity is that of autonomy. So animals that are more intelligent, more cognitively complex, get bored more easily because their brain needs that stimulation. And having a lack of control over their own movements seems to have a negative impact on their welfare as well. So multiple studies have found that when elephants in zoos don't have control over when they spend their time indoors or outdoors, like they don't have 24-hour access to both areas, they tend to have worse welfare than when they do have access to both areas. And it's hard to know if this is simply an issue of space or whether it's actually due to feeling a lack of control over their own life. But it's certainly possible that the lack of control over their own life is actually what's causing the negative welfare associated with this. So yeah, I'll kind of open it up to Jim now because I think I've probably gone over my time, but happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Wonderful job. We're going to turn
Thank
it
you.
over right now to Jim Karani. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Mickey. Let me set up. Let me share my screen. Awesome. So I'm Jim Karani, and my
Hey, Jim,
job.
if you
Sorry.
just put it in presentation mode.
I think it is, no? Just give me a second. It's in presentation mode. Okay. Okay. I bet you can see it now, yes?
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So my job as an attorney and as a lawyer who is heavily interested in protecting elephants is to understand how do we translate all the science we've just had into policy and law, which allows us to protect elephants. And one of my biggest challenges has been in trying to make the amazing science that you've just been presented with today palatable enough for legislators to be in a situation where they can understand why it's important to protect elephants. I'm Jim Karani. I'm a wildlife lawyer, and I am the general counsel of a small organization registered in Kenya and working to enhance the status of elephants in Africa, called Lawyers for Animal Protection in Africa. So I come from Kenya. We are known for our amazing marathon runners, but more importantly, we're known for our spectacular wildlife. It is the superabundance in the Masai Mara or the magical Amboseli. And Amboseli is widely known for, of course, being the greatest show in Africa, Mount Kilimanjaro in the background. But more importantly, it's known for its elephants. Its more iconic it's more iconic wildlife. So for most people, they see elephants in the wild, alive, in their majesty. But I, as a lawyer who follows up wildlife crime cases in courts all over Africa, trying to make sure wildlife traffickers and poachers are brought to justice, my reality is slightly different. The photo to my right is how I see elephants mostly brought to court like. This is how I see elephants mostly. And I can tell you in some of the big cases I have followed up on that relate to more than 10 tons of elephant ivory in evidence. This could easily translate to more than 1,000 elephants, slaughtered for someone to have 10 tons of elephant ivory in evidence. So the way I see elephants is very, very different. And of course, very, very painful. Then the question becomes, how bad is the poaching crisis for elephants? And what is the law doing about it? So all over Africa, a couple of years ago, I think in 2016, a huge study was done, which is called the Great Elephant Census, which was pretty much trying to figure out just how are elephant populations in countries that truly harbor habitats for elephants. And what we found was rather shocking. It is true, elephants are in crisis, but in some areas, there is hope. On the graph in front of you, anywhere you see in green means species are increasing or stable, or are elephant population are increasing. Anywhere you see yellow color, it kind of means that the populations there are stable. They haven't increased nor declined. But anywhere you see in red, it means elephant populations have rapidly declined. And of course, I think Cameroon kind of shocked all of us with an 83% loss of elephant population in 5 years. And this was in 2016. It's been 8 years. The pandemic has happened. We haven't gone back to see how bad the situation has been. But a couple of things have been done to make sure that we truly try to stop this. So in the last 8 years, a couple of things have happened. For example, a couple of countries have started coordinating, collecting data on poaching, just trying to understand how big this problem is. And from the graph in front of you, you can see from data collected by African researchers working in these fields, working in these communities, we were fascinating to see that it seems that the poaching for elephant ivory has really gone down compared to the killing of elephants whenever there's conflict between elephants and farmers or elephants and communities. So a lot has changed, and a lot of that traces to the law, and I'm about to show you how. So the number one thing that we noticed that we had to attend to first in the last maybe 2 or 3 decades had been to literally look into the trafficking of ivory. How is it that ivory is able to move from an ecosystem in the middle of the African jungle and be found in an antique store or luxury store in Asia? We wanted to truly understand the dynamics of this and put in laws that stop this from happening. What we found was I was ridiculously fascinated by wildlife traffickers. Their convergence and efficiency in moving products across continents was fascinating. Their ability to use money laundering, corrupting individuals to be able to move their products. Of course, there are very ingenious methods of smuggling and avoiding customs were fascinating. Some of these cases should have been scripts for a movie. One thing we also found was the convergence of different dynamics of criminality. For example, we will find there were traffickers that had heavily specialized in one specific product. There's a guy who moves rhino. There's another one who moves elephant ivory. So if we were targeting, understanding crime science approaches, we must first understand why are they specializing. The other thing we saw is, of course, the convergence of wildlife trafficking and serious crime. So the human trafficking, the human smuggling, and the narco trafficking. Turns out, if criminals are moving drugs because it's lucrative, they will also move wildlife products because it is also lucrative. And then the most fascinating thing we found out is the transnational networks cooperating. This is Chinese triads operating with Mexican cartels, operating with criminals in East Africa to move different types of products to make money. This we thought from a crime crime science perspective was very fascinating. Even more shocking was us finding out that any single time we impound a big consignment of ivory, we literally find tusks that have been collected from different parts of Africa in different parts of the, different countries. For example, a tusk will be collected in Nigeria, which is like 9,000 miles away, and another one will be collected, say, in Tanzania, and both of them will end up in the same shipment. So we were fascinated by this. And this was only revealed through the amazing research done at the University of Washington by Dr. Sam Wassa and his team. We were able to finally connect ivory trafficking across the entire African network. Then largely, finally, the elephant in the room will always be and has always been corruption. Without addressing that, we have no chance to address wildlife crime in Africa. So any approaches that look into fighting anti-corruption internationally have to look into how Africans perceive corruption. And I pulled up at least 7, 8 reports, all of them talking about corruption being a big problem. And then, of course, who are the insiders? We're talking about transporters, the clearing and forwarding agents, the customs officers. They can't pretend to not know what they're doing anymore. So by compelling on law enforcement authorities, especially American, the EU authorities, they have now started finding customs officials, liable and culpable for trafficking offenses. This has been quite fascinating. And then, of course, my job is to show you how criminal law has been used and applied to truly save and help elephants. And in one of these cases is an example I've pulled up for you. In the Southern District of New York, the DA was able to indict Mao Zokroma, who is, I want to think, East Africa's most notorious ivory trafficker. He had trafficked in over 10 tons of elephant ivory and millions of dollars in rhino horn. He was extradited from Uganda, where he came to face charges in New York. Now, he had charges of racketeering, slapped on him, which we thought would really, really work. But he was found guilty, he was convicted. But then his sentence was 63 months, literally just serving, I think what is just 5 years and a shave, or maybe 2 months. And then, of course, he had a little bit of time served. So he did stay for 3 years. And I think he's free now, as we speak, which is kind of shocking because as an attorney working in Africa, I can tell you at least 40 countries in Africa have revised their laws to make wildlife legislation tougher, to put heavier penalties on criminals. And this is a result of it. We can see, for example, in Uganda, a wildlife trafficker got life imprisonment. In Kenya, you can see this Chinese national was shocked to find that he was being fined, close to $250,000 for trafficking in elephant ivory. I think he was found with a bangle or something. To your right, that is not an old lady. That is not anybody's grandma. That is also one of East Africa's most notorious ivory traffickers, Yang Penglanj, colloquially called the Ivory Queen, who was sentenced to 15 years in jail in Tanzania for ivory trafficking. And then, of course, we have these 3 chaps over here in Kenya who faced 10 years in prison for only being found with 2 tusks. So why are the judges giving 5 years in the United States when we could easily slap heavier penalties on these people in our jurisdictions? So we do have a problem with the sentencing, but we are truly pleased that there seem to be law enforcement approaches that are working. Now, I know heavier penalties does not mean we are deterring people from committing crimes, but we are punishing the people who are committing these crimes, which I think is equally important. And they need to serve longer jail terms for this. They truly do, because of the damage they've done. And from the science you've had, I mean, clearly they've done a lot of harm to the ecosystem and to those elephants themselves. Then, of course, moving on to a different issue. Well, I only had 20 minutes to discuss about issues that people talk about years. So I hope I do this issue justice. So one of the biggest problems that we've noticed now in protecting elephants is policy making. And all of you know the power of administrative law in helping us challenge decisions, seek judicial review, and truly help us, challenge poor decisions from governments. I will show you a couple of these decisions and how either administrative law interventions in the United States or in Africa have transformed fortunes for elephants. in front of you is a tracking photo of elephants that are crossing the Kenya-Tanzania border. This line right here in the middle, smack in the middle here, is the Kenya-Tanzania border. Now, this is the Amboseli ecosystem, which is pretty much the elephants I've been showing you, where one of our most unique population of elephants resides. And over and above, they do cross over the border. As you know, they don't have passports, they don't even recognize the borders. To them, it's a shared ecosystem. But here's the problem. Kenya and Tanzania have different protection of elephants. Tanzania shoot the elephants, they allow hunting. In Kenya, we stopped hunting in the 80s. So when our elephants cross over, they are hunted. So we have been, prevailing on our courts and telling our judges that, hey, you must review these decisions of government and policy that we feel are adverse to what are protected species that straddle international borders are protected by international law. The Convention of Migratory Species could never be more clear enough. You have the sovereign right to do whatever you want to do with wildlife in your country. However, you lack autonomy when it comes to species that migrate across jurisdictions. This should not be controversial, but it is. And some of these elephants are some of our most iconic elephants. And of course, hunters are not flying into Kenya to shoot these scrawny looking elephants. They're going for the biggest elephants, the prized elephants. And as for us, when we look at this issue, we see parallels with how colonialism started in our country. This is a power conversation. I don't see a single Tanzanian affording, any of these permits to go and shoot these elephants. Yet again, it is only foreigners who are doing this. So there is a question as to how do we approach, trophy hunting of elephants as a moral and also a social issue. I mean, we have seen that the ban on elephant hunting in Kenya has been very useful to protecting its species. Most of the species that were used by our scientists earlier are the Amboseli ecosystem, population, which had never been hunted before. And once they cross over into Tanzania, they are hunted. So, using administrative law, we are able to go to, for example, the East Africa Court of Justice and sue Tanzania for its policy directives, and we hope we will prevail. And this problem is pervasive because elephants do not truly have passports. I mean, they have populations straddling many borders and they move across habitats. And we can't have one habitat having a different conservation plan than another because, elephants, we think we owe them a consistency in how we conserve them. So there is a need to truly, harmonize the laws and the protection of elephant species in this area. And this is where lawyers come in. This is where you come in as a member of the ABA. This is where you come in as a member of the UIA to truly support the policy making. And lawyers are largely missing in some of these spaces. Then, of course, administrative law efforts in the United States look like this. In front of you is a final rule that was published by the Fish and Wildlife Service, in where imports and import prohibitions are placed on wildlife trophies of elephants coming from these areas with these problematic policies. We truly see that stopping hunters from bringing back their trophies has been very instrumental in shaping policy, in making them really think about their decision making, making them really think about what they're doing. And we think this brings them to the table where we're able to discuss on what conservation targets are they reaching and how to truly take care of these animals. Then, of course, you may have heard of the more horrible policies from Africa where Namibia and Zimbabwe have decided to kill elephants and then feed them to the local population. That's a policy. And, I don't intend to denigrate their sovereignty or talk bad about them, but I truly see this as a horrible policy and a horrible decision. And I do have incredible grounds to do that and to show for that, and grounds that I do believe are can be used or ripe for judicial review. I think killing elephants to feed to your local population is absurd, considering that the two countries have the highest risk, at least 50% risk of zoonotic spillover effects. This is an excerpt of the Global Health Index. This is where the WHO has examined these two countries and asked the more important question: how good are these countries at responding to a zoonotic disease outbreak? How can they, for example, after they've fed the locals with all these elephants, a zoonotic crisis hits, how do they fix it? And according from this score, they do not have the ability or the means or the capability or even the personnel to be able to respond to this. This, I feel, is a powerful ground for review in a common law jurisdiction like Zimbabwe. And of course, we are prevailing on and discussing this with communities in those countries to pretty much see this as, viable, approaches. And then, of course, on the last one, it's the elephants in captivity. I mean, there's only so much we can say about this. The science is very, very clear. And for us as lawyers, it's learning how to translate this intelligence and this evidence into actual policy directives. It's us actually translating all of this intelligence into evidence and bringing it into court. It's us understanding, for example, the awesome abilities of these animals to feel and to exist and their rights to be who they should be. It's something we really need to consider for at least 20,000 captive elephants all over the world. And just recently, I was at an aquarium and zoos conference where they were literally talking about the zoo of the future. Like 10 years from now, we're talking of augmented AI reality. We're talking of holograms. I mean, we will look back one day to how we had zoos, and we will all cringe and puke and gawk and be shocked at what we did. And I'm happy to see that the industry itself is trying to pivot away from the use of live animals, the same way we stopped using animals in live exhibitions. So in two main ways, I have shown you how criminal law is being used. Directly to bring the traffickers and poachers of wildlife to justice. And secondly, how administrative law can transform, fortunes for elephants, both in the African context and, of course, in the American context. And I think that will be it from me at the moment. Do look up our organization, do join us and be what we think is a fierce advocate of animals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think you made a very important point. A lot of folks don't realize that elephants are still being taken from the wild in Africa and sold and brought to circuses and zoos here in the United States. So now I'm going to turn it over to Debbie, and she's going to talk more about captive elephants. Thanks, Debbie.
Hi, thank you so much. First, I just want to say how excited I am to be on this panel and to welcome everyone that is here and listening. And I want to just give a little shout out to Mr. Karani, who's probably the most humble attorney I've ever met, which is saying something in attorney world, because he's the very first animal rights attorney ever in Kenya. So he's a true pioneer. And there's been many people that have followed him since, but I think that's incredible. And also to Mickey Pardo, because I didn't catch it in his presentation if he mentioned his paper that's called African Elephants Address One Another with Individually Specific Name-like Calls. That paper went to the moon and back in terms of science in the United States. And I'm thrilled that a scientist who is studying elephants could get their science to actually hit so many people. So I am just completely gobsmacked. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and get this. Oh, hang tight here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Jim Karani said. And I want to examine that intersection between the legal frameworks and the scientific principles as they apply to court cases involving elephants. And specifically, the first one, I'm not going to hit this too hard. but I'm a scientist, and so I work on different court cases as a consultant. And so I speak the language of science, but I also speak the language of law. And I think that is so important, as those of you that are coming up or that might work on elephant cases in the future, is what Jim had said, is to have somebody on somebody to speak to of the science, to make sure that the lawyers clearly understand what that science means, because both of these languages, in my experience, are very complicated. And sometimes we think we know what it means, but it actually means something different. Obviously, the lawyer is going to be the only dictionary that those judges are ever going to see. So I'm going to talk about this one first, which is Asian versus African experts. And this might seem a little redundant, but I think it does need a little honorable mention because I see this happen all the time. So reasons for court cases are usually one of these three things. You're trying to get an elephant out of a zoo, or it's being abused in some way, or it's suffering some medical issue. These are not typically species-specific problems. So in the past, law firms have just sort of gone after whatever elephant expert they can, and they use a lot of the same ones in multiple cases that I've noticed. And what has ended up happening is this argument keeps coming up, in that, why are experts of an entirely different species being used in court? An African elephant scientist that specializes in African elephants is different than an Asian elephant scientist. They are specialized in their species. And when a court case happens and you're using experts of a different species, it allows the other side to do the same. And in some of the court cases that I've worked, the other side will show up with, say, like a veterinarian as their expert, but it's a dog and cat veterinarian. And suddenly this lawyer is now arguing with the judge about why they should use their non-species specific expert, and then trying to also explain, the similarities or the differences between African and Asian elephants, when, in my opinion, this argument is just a colossal waste of time. If we just show up with just the species experts of the animal that we're fighting for, it eliminates that entire argument. So I just wanted to give this a quick mention that moving forward, I hope that we just all use the species of the animal, the experts of the animal that we're fighting for. Also, there are hundreds of Asian elephant experts, as there are hundreds of African elephant experts. And that's one of the things that I bring to the table too, is I'm always keeping a running list of different experts in different fields in case, I can be of help in a court case in the future. So the second argument, this is one that comes up in absolutely every court case that I've ever studied or worked on that has anything to do with releasing captive elephants from a zoo. So when a case goes to court and a group wants to get elephants out of a zoo, the court always needs to know where, or they'll always ask, where is that elephant going to go? And it's almost always going to a sanctuary. But here's the argument. We've all heard it. A sanctuary is still keeping an elephant in captivity. Now, they're not wrong. The elephant is still in a form of captivity. But I really want to show why I think this is a completely ridiculous argument, and it is my hope that we can overcome this so we never have to address this in a court again. So I'm going to use this example. This is a football field. This represents 4 million acres. In this paper down below that I've cited here, they followed African females and males across southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. And this was the amount of space that these elephants were utilizing on a regular basis. So just for argument's sake, I'm just going to say that this field represents 4 million acres. Now, there's a book here called Jumbo Ghost. This book was written by Dr. Michael Schmidt, who was a 30-year veterinarian at the Oregon Zoo. Now, in this book, he makes one of the greatest cases I've ever heard of why elephants will never, ever thrive in captivity. And so he uses this example, and I'm just stealing it from him. So the matchbook represents a zoo. And when you put the matchbook that represents 1.5 acres, which is the average size of a zoo in the United States, against the 4 million acres that an elephant technically needs or roams in the wild, you can see the vast difference. Now, obviously, if this were spatially correct, you would never in a million years be able to see that matchbook. So But for visual purposes, you can see just this is how little space an elephant gets access to in a zoo. So there have been all these zoo renovations, and it's very rare that a zoo has been able to renovate itself 3 times the size that it was from the 1950s and 60s. But let's say again, for argument's sake, that a zoo is able to do that, and they increase their size, their exhibit size, by 3 times more than what it used to be. And when you put this back into scale, yeah, it's bigger. And so, yes, it's better, but is it enough? It's not even close, right? So if you look at it compared to the zoo of the old days, it's just not that much different. So how much larger then is a sanctuary? This is the piece that is missing in all of the court cases that I watch, is that these figures are not really being brought out. And I think it's so important that not only are the numbers brought out, but also the visual representation. So I was one of the researchers on the largest captive elephant welfare project in North America. And this is one of the papers that I worked on. And part of my job was to help tally the total amount of space that elephants have access to in North America. Now, most elephants are separated by species in zoos. Africans are kept separate from Asians, which is why these numbers are different. But as you can see, it's only 1.75 acres for African elephants and 1.14 for Asians. So that's how much space they get on average. And if that's an average, that means that some of those get a heck of a lot less space than that. And when you compare this to the sanctuaries, this is how much space we're talking about that elephants get access to inside these sanctuaries. 2,700 acres, which they just expanded at TESS. It's over 3,000 now. Paws has 80 acres for 11 elephants, and Erna in Georgia has 3 elephants with 750 acres. So when you look at this acreage, it's so non-comparable to a 1.5 acre exhibit. And you can see the example here, 1.5 to 152 on average is how much elephants have access to in a sanctuary versus a zoo. It's just literally not comparable. I also think it's important to show a visual. So I'm standing here at Elephant Haven in France. This is the elephant sanctuary in France. These arrows show one edge of the exhibit, but behind where the camera is taking the picture, there's an additional 30 acres behind us. So if I was to walk that area in an entire, it would take me a day to walk that whole area. It's over 150 acres for one elephant. Now they've got 2. So when you place this also on the field, and you say, well, is a sanctuary enough space for an elephant to thrive? Or is it comparable to a wild? No, it's not. It's not at all comparable to the wild, right? But is it better than the zoos, or even a zoo that's been renovated 3 times the size? Yes, it's significantly better. So even though they might be kept in behind, they're still fenced in, it's just so vastly different. These are the sanctuaries. I call them legitimate, and I'll get to that in a second. But these are the sanctuaries in the US, in France, and in Brazil. There's more in Asia, of course. These all have websites. I put their websites up here because these sanctuaries, you can go to their websites and you can see they have pictures of their space on there. Many of them have YouTube channels where they show drone footage. My hope is that in one of these cases one day, when this argument comes up in court, as it does every time, that a lawyer is allowed to show a visual representation of just drone footage going over one of these sanctuaries while the argument is happening in court. And by the time that argument has ended in court, that drone footage still will not have gotten to the farthest part of that elephant sanctuary, which would make the point. Because I'm not getting the impression that the judges in these cases are really understanding the difference, because most of the sanctuaries are closed to the public and most people do not know just how vastly different they are than zoos. Now, I say legitimate sanctuaries because the number one, there's a lot of places that call themselves sanctuaries. They're not. So this is how you can tell if it's a legitimate sanctuary versus just a puppy mill, a breeding facility for elephants that call themselves a sanctuary. The number one factor is that they do not breed their elephants. The second factor is that elephants have autonomy, which is something that Mickey touched on earlier. They are not tied to an elephant keeper's schedule. In most zoos across the United States, elephant keepers only work 8 hours a day. which means that regardless of the size of that elephant exhibit at the zoo, regardless if they made it 15 times the size, the elephants are still held in barns, either chained down or locked in small stalls for 14 to 16 hours per day. And it's usually longer than that. And the reason why it's longer is because all of the elephants have to be bathed each morning to wash off all the waste that they've slept in overnight. They have foot care. If they're breeding the elephants, they're not going to let the elephants wander too far away because that breeding window is so tight. They need to keep those elephants close. So when an elephant is at a sanctuary, the autonomy piece of this means that they're not tied to any elephant keeper schedule. They can come and go as they wish. They can stay out all night if they want. They can be in the barn if they wish. They can come and go as they please, eat what they want, and hang out with whoever they want. And the third thing is that sanctuaries are not open to the public. So when you are looking at whether a place who calls themselves a sanctuary is legitimate, see if they meet this criteria. So the third thing that I want to get to are some data points that I think are really important that sort of talk about the cost of conservation between captive elephants and wild. So here's an overview of the general care and feeding costs of elephants in captivity. For young and healthy, it's around 75 grand. For old and sickly, it's over 100, and it can be way more than 100,000 annually. And there's roughly 400 elephants in captivity in North America. When you add this all up, now I went shy on the number of elderly sick elephants just to, put the zoos in the best light. It costs roughly $32.5 million a year. That doesn't sound like that much, right? To keep all the elephants in captivity in the United States. But when we compare this to the wild elephants in Kenya, Kenya has 23 national parks. Not all of the national parks have elephants, but there are roughly 5,000 Kenya Wildlife Service employees that work in the national parks in Kenya. Now, that number also includes temporary employees. It includes employees that work in an office in Nairobi. It also includes all the KWS rangers that work in parks that don't have any elephants. But there are roughly 20,000 wild elephants in Kenya, wild, right? So when you want to look at how much this costs, 20,000 wild elephants to 400 captive elephants, you can go pull up, anybody can do this, this is public information, the Kenya Wildlife Service financial documents. This is their 2023 financial documents. Now, I'm interested in only these two numbers, which is the total compensation paid to employees and the operation and maintenance costs included in that. So again, this number is pretty high because we're talking about KWS employees that don't work in any of the national parks with elephants. That comes to $8.7 billion. But that is in Kenyan shillings. That's not in US dollars. That's in shillings. So if we translate this to actually US dollars, it comes out to $64 million. Now, when you compare that to the $32 million that it takes to keep elephants in captivity, well, that's double. So you need to look at this as the cost per elephant. So for the 20,000 wild elephants, it only costs $3,200 per year for each of those elephants, where it costs $81,000 for the captives. So these numbers are not at all comparable. So you can see the difference. So the last thing that I want to say is that if the science of elephants was actually, if elephants were thriving in captivity, I'm going to stop sharing this. If elephants were thriving in captivity, then that would bear out in the science. It's not. And so when you look at the length of time that elephants actually live in captivity, the paper that I usually refer to is a paper where researchers combined all of the elephants in captivity in North America and Europe. And that number came out to only 17 years old for African elephants and 19 years old for Asian elephants. Several years later, the American zoos came out with their own paper, and their numbers came in at roughly the 30s. Elephants are not living near to their normal age. We know that they live until the age of our age, 65, 75, in that range, and that's an average also. So when an elephant is dying at the age of 30, that is still a huge problem. So So my goal, my hope is that, these figures get brought into these cases and that more scientists or people that understand both languages can participate in both of the cases, in the cases that are coming forward. So that's what I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate that. So much good information. And if I'd like to invite all of the panelists back on so that we could have a brief Q&A. Great. Hey, everybody. Well, I'm actually going to start with Debbie because I wanted to follow up and ask you, what fundamental changes would you like to see in the legal system based on the science, the elephant science that we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I was watching, so just last night, several people are aware that the Colorado Supreme Court just heard a case by the Non-Human Rights Project to release the elephants in the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. Now, one of the, what they were asking for, hang tight one second, let me find it exactly. Oh, they were looking for the line. They kept saying this, and they've said this in all of the cases where they want to know what is the line that separates elephants versus other animals, right? Now, Mickey touched on this, and this is something that I think that is effective, and I haven't really heard it a lot, but we did bring this up when I worked on a non-human rights case a long time ago with the elephants Minnie and Beulah. It was the neurons that Mickey touched on in his talk. So these neurons are called the spindle neurons or the von Economo neurons. These are the emotional epicenter of a human brain. And then they were discovered in 3 different groups of animals. All the species of elephants, the great apes, and also the orcas, dolphins, many species of whales. That is a separating line. And that is something that I wish was maybe, delved into deeper, because I feel like the courts are asking for that line and they're not getting the line. And if there is something there that does separate those 3 groups of animals, which coincidentally are the 3 groups that the Non-Human Rights Project have been fighting for, I would hope that would come in. Those were also part of all of the affidavits of the African elephant experts that we brought onto that case as well. So that's something that I'm hopeful as a change that maybe could come into some of the court cases, or that an education campaign can go out about how deeply important that is.
Thank you for that. And full disclosure, I am affiliated with the Non-Human Rights Project, but this is not an NHRP program. So to clear that up. Jim, can you talk a little bit about the difference between rights and welfare and for elephants and how that's playing out in Kenya right now?
Oh, yeah. I kind of feel like, there has been like this movement to, espouse and pretty much put animal rights in constitutions and the legal text of most countries. And we kind of did research at John Jay to try and look at whether, these animal rights that are kind of protected and enshrined in these constitutions are actually showing up in these other laws, in how animals are treated in captivity, how animals are traded, how animals are bred, how they're taken care of. And those rights are largely missing. So as far as a practitioner, I can tell you, animal rights in our constitution is almost doing absolutely nothing for the species when we now look at when we look at other texts. So in Kenya, the animal rights movement has pretty much looked at this, especially when it comes to elephants. Our president has gone out of his way because, they do have executive powers, almost like a king, nothing like in America, but they can, make these decrees where they can protect specific species of animals. And ever since from our founding president, he protected this one big elephant, just called Ahmed. And he was one of those massive elephants that pretty much was being protected as as a part of our national heritage, like actually a national monument. And once he died, it's pretty much like, his entire, body was brought into the museum, and it's part of what we show people. You can't walk into a national museum without seeing that. So when it comes to the protection of our iconic species, our country has gone out of its way to do this. And this is how we are able to track these elephants and see they crossing into Tanzania and they're not coming back. because we call our iconic elephants. So in terms of welfare, the biggest challenge for us has been in diagnosing conflict. Whenever, for most people, I can tell you this, most people who live right next to elephants, elephants to them, they impact them a lot in terms of crop raiding, and when they raid crops, wherever they interact with them, and they end up in human injury or death. So in terms of animal welfare, we've seen instances where people are actually now getting tired with all the conflict, and they are harming this species. So there are programs that are coming up in our country that are trying to alleviate this, like compensation programs. I believe elephants that belong to the state, if they destroy your crops, that's an illegal seizure. It's kind of like a right to property thing. The government should be able to compensate you for that. It's literally in the text of the law. And over the years, this has translated in actual practice. And one day it will get perfect. Things are not perfect now. People are getting compensated. And we are trying to make people get to a situation where they can live with these animals and coexist with them. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a question for Mickey as well. How do you think we should balance the fact that elephants suffer in captivity with the fact that many types of cognition experiments can only be done with captive animals?
Yeah, so I think the challenge here is that as scientists, we are often trained both implicitly and explicitly that we should be focused on like whether we can answer a particular scientific question rather than whether we should. And I think that there are far too many scientists who have just sort of been indoctrinated into this way of thinking that if a scientific question is interesting, then it's justified to answer that question regardless of what of how much suffering the methodology may cause to individual animals. And I think we need to stop that, frankly. If there are questions that can't be addressed without using methodologies that cause animals to suffer, then those questions just simply should not be addressed. I'm sorry, it sucks that we can't answer every question that might pique our curiosity, but that's just the reality of the situation. There are a lot of questions that we can't address scientifically because doing so would involve, unethical treatment of humans. And we've evolved enough as a society at this point that we don't do those kinds of experiments anymore, although we certainly used to in the past. And I think we should extend that to non-humans as well. If I'm all for scientific inquiry for the sake of curiosity, but not at the expense of the rights and well-being of individuals.
Thank you for that. I think it's important that we start thinking more about animals and putting some of their needs before ours. Well, we're at time, so I'm going to conclude our program. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. This program has been recorded and we're going to be posting it later. Thank you so much for joining us today.